Imagine being at a point in life where everything seems to be going wrong, and what you value most is slipping through your fingers. We've all faced moments of loss, uncertainty, or even despair. It's in those times that the most unexpected decisions can change the course of our lives. In today's story, you're going to connect with characters facing that exact dilemma. When the unexpected appears, will they make the right choice? Come with me, let's discover together. It was a frigid night in New York, and the strong winds swept through the streets of the city that never sleeps. David Klein, a real estate magnate, was driving through the empty avenues, absorbed in his thoughts. He had everything money could buy: success, respect, and power. But at 33, David felt emptier than ever. His grandfather, Henry Klein, a business titan, had changed his will. The new clause was brutal: the first of the grandchildren to have a child would inherit the entire family empire. The race for an heir had begun, and David was competing against his younger brother Peter, who was already married and well-positioned to win. David, on the other hand, had always avoided romantic commitments. Love for him was an illusion that only served to complicate a life he had designed to be flawless. But the weight of that new rule was crushing him. He needed an heir but didn't want a wife or the burden of a soulless relationship. He was lost in thought as his car glided through the busy streets of New York. The glow of the lights reflected on the glass, but he barely noticed the movement around him. His mind was fixated on a single goal: finding a way to secure the future of the Klein empire. Ever since his grandfather had added the new clause to the will, the one stating that the first grandchild to have a child would inherit full control of the fortune, David had felt pressure like never before. He needed an heir, but his solitary life and disdain for relationships made everything more complicated. Marry for convenience? He had already dismissed that idea. Adopt a child? That wouldn't seem genuine in his grandfather's eyes. Every solution that crossed his mind seemed more impractical than the last. As the car moved down the avenues, David recalled recent conversations with his lawyers. They all offered viable options, but none seemed to work. He didn't have time to build a fake relationship, let alone find a woman willing to play the game. Time was against him, and with each passing second, his brother Peter was closer to winning. David let out a heavy sigh, his eyes locked on nothing, until something unusual caught his attention. There on a corner, sitting on the cold pavement, was a young woman, her gaze weary, holding a baby in her arms. Her body was curled up against the cutting wind of the night, her arms wrapped around the small being as if he were the only thing that mattered. Her disheveled hair, torn clothes, and the exhaustion painted on her face screamed of desperation. Yet, despite her state of abandonment, there was something about her that radiated strength. At that exact moment, as David looked at the woman and the baby in her arms, an idea began to form in his mind. This could work, he thought, a different spark flashing in his eyes. He didn't need a traditional relationship. He didn't need a wife or a long-term commitment. All he needed was a baby, presented as his heir. And that woman, with her child in her arms, could be the key to solving his problem. "Stop the car," he said abruptly to the driver. The driver, surprised, looked into the rearview mirror. "Sir." "Stop the car now," David repeated, his tone firm and decisive, his eyes never leaving the woman on the sidewalk. The car smoothly came to a stop by the curb, and David stepped out without hesitation. He didn't have a fully formed plan, but he knew this was his opportunity. As he approached her, the image of the baby becoming his heir was already firmly rooted in his mind. He felt the weight of the decision, but also the rush of adrenaline from being so close to solving the greatest dilemma of his life. David walked towards the woman, his steady footsteps echoing down the quiet street. She noticed him approaching and held the baby tighter against her chest, her tired eyes filled with suspicion. "Do you need help?" David asked, his voice low but without the kindness one might expect from someone offering aid. "First, let me introduce myself. My name is David Klein. I'll get straight to the point. I need an heir," he said with a bluntness that left her speechless for a few seconds. "I need you and your baby to pretend to be my family. In return, you'll have a place to live, money, and your child's future secured. All you have to do is pretend he's my son." She looked at him as if he were insane. You're serious?" David nodded without hesitation. "More than ever. Think about it. You and your baby will never have to be cold again, never worry about where you'll sleep or what you'll eat. And all you have to do is pretend for a few months. When it's over, you're free to move on, and I'll give you everything you need to start over." She hesitated, looking down at the baby in her arms. She knew life on the streets was getting harder every day, and the future for her child was even more uncertain. The man standing before her seemed confident, and as absurd as his proposal was, it felt like her only chance to give her baby a better life. I don't know, she said, her voice wavering. Still in shock and confusion, she answered, My name is Grace. David knew he had to push a little more. You have a lot to gain, Grace. Think about your child. Think about his future. I'm not asking you to do anything except pretend. Nothing more. A simple contract, and everything will be taken care of. Grace, still confused and hesitant, looked down at the baby one last time. This wasn't just a decision about her life, it was about the life of the child she wanted to protect so desperately. As absurd as the idea was, she knew she couldn't refuse an opportunity like this. I accept, she said, her voice firm, though her heart raced. David felt an immediate sense of relief. He had found the solution. The baby would be the heir, Grace would be his temporary family, and he would secure his victory in the race for the inheritance. Everything was falling into place, just as he had planned. In the following days, Grace was taken to a luxury hotel. There she had everything she had never imagined: new clothes, food, medical care for her and the baby. After a few days of care, provided by the benefits David had offered, she was transformed. Her appearance had greatly improved, revealing just how beautiful she was, hidden beneath the hardship of living on the streets. As the days passed, David began spending more time with Grace. The arrangement he had made seemed to be working perfectly, but slowly, he found himself growing more curious about the woman with whom he had entered into this charade. She was different from the people he was used to. There was a quiet strength in Grace, a resilience he couldn't ignore. She was beautiful, even in the chaos of her situation, and David couldn't help but wonder what had brought her to such a low point. One afternoon, while Liam slept in his crib, they sat in the living room of the luxury hotel where Grace was temporarily staying. David watched her discreetly, trying to piece together a puzzle that didn't make sense to him. Grace, he began, his voice softer than usual, I know our agreement doesn't require me to know about your past, but I can't help but wonder how someone like you ended up on the streets. Even in her exhaustion, she lifted her wary gaze. I don't need charity, she muttered, trying to hold on to her dignity despite the vulnerability of her situation. David smiled faintly, a smile that hid the true nature of his proposal. I'm not here to give you charity, he said, his voice growing more direct. I have an offer for you. The young woman frowned, confused, but said nothing. She just watched him, waiting. Grace, who had been lost in thought, stopped. She had never spoken about her past to anyone since everything had fallen apart. But David's gaze seemed genuinely interested, something she hadn't expected. With a heavy sigh, she decided that maybe it was time to share. Had nowhere to go, Grace began, her voice low and melancholic. My family lived far away, and we didn't keep in touch much. When I found out I was pregnant, I thought I had everything under control. I was living with the father of my child, and at the time, he seemed happy about the news. But things changed quickly. She paused, her eyes distant as painful memories resurfaced. Not long after I told him about the pregnancy, he started to pull away. He stopped supporting me, emotionally and financially. At first, he said he was just confused, but over time, he left for good. No explanations, no goodbyes. One day, he just didn't come back. David furrowed his brow, feeling a mix of indignation and sadness for her situation. He abandoned you while you were pregnant? He asked, his voice now more resolute. Grace nodded, pressing her lips together as she fought back tears. Yes. And that's when everything started to fall apart. I lost my job soon after. No one wanted to hire a pregnant woman. I was running out of money, and the bills kept piling up. By the time Liam was born, I couldn't afford the rent anymore. I was evicted just days after leaving the hospital. She closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of her words. No family nearby, no friends who could help. I had no choice. Everything happened so fast I barely had time to process it. Before I knew it, I was on the streets with my newborn in my arms, with nowhere to go. David sat in silence for a moment, absorbing everything she had said. He had always believed that poor or homeless people had somehow failed in their own lives, but now, hearing Grace's story, he saw a different reality. She wasn't a victim of poor choices, She was a woman crushed by circumstances beyond her control. "I had no idea," he said, his voice softer now, filled with empathy he didn't know he was capable of feeling. "You've been through so much." Grace shrugged, a sad smile forming on her lips. "I did what any mother would do. I tried to survive for me and for him. I just wanted to make sure he was safe, even when I had nothing. But living on the streets with a baby, it's something I never imagined for myself. I didn't want this. But at that point, it felt like the whole world was against me." David felt a lump form in his throat. He had always believed that money and power could fix anything, but Grace's story made him realize that there are situations where even that isn't enough. And for the first time in a long time, he felt a genuine desire to help beyond the arrangement they had made. He looked at Grace, admiring her courage. "You're stronger than you think, Grace. I don't know how you managed to go through all of this on your own." Grace sighed, still looking at the baby. "I didn't feel strong, David. I was just surviving, one day at a time." After hearing Grace's story, David remained silent for a moment. He had never met someone who had faced such adversity and yet maintained so much strength. Looking at her and little Liam, he felt a tightness in his chest that he had never experienced before. The agreement, which had once seemed simple and strategic, now carried an emotional weight he hadn't anticipated. "I didn't know you went through all of that," he said, breaking the silence with a voice filled with sincerity. "But now that we're in this together, I promise you'll never have to worry about the future again." Grace simply nodded, a faint smile of gratitude crossing her lips. David then took a deep breath, as if closing an internal door and returning to the present. "Well, I think it's time we prepare," he said, reverting to his practical tone. "Tonight, you're going to have dinner with me. We need to sort out a few things before we tell my grandfather everything. I've already hired a trusted nanny to stay with Liam here at the hotel." With that, they left Grace's past behind, focusing on the next step in the plan that would change both their lives. That night, he took her to dinner at an upscale restaurant, the kind of place Grace never imagined herself in. Sitting there, surrounded by linen tablecloths and fine silverware, she felt out of place. Her hands trembled slightly as she tried to pick up the fork, and a piece of food fell back onto the plate. David, who had always valued perfection, merely smiled. And it was at that moment that Grace began to see David in a different light. He was no longer the cold, distant man she had met at first. "You don't have to pretend to be someone else, Grace," David said, with a gentleness that surprised her. "You are so much more than anyone in this room." She looked at him, her eyes brimming with tears, something she rarely allowed herself to feel. "You may be a rich man, but you have no idea what it's like to fight for survival every single day," she said, her voice trembling. "For you, this is normal. For me, every meal is a luxury, every moment of peace, a gift." David remained silent, deeply impacted by the raw honesty in her words. He had always seen life as a series of achievements and battles, but Grace was showing him that true strength wasn't found in external victories, but in surviving the storms within. In the days that followed, David began spending more time with Grace and Liam. He found himself laughing at the baby's little mishaps and having conversations with Grace about things he had never discussed with anyone before. He no longer saw Grace as someone just fulfilling a deal. As they strolled through the hotel gardens, David realized that life seemed less cold, less mechanical when they were by his side. One afternoon, while Liam slept in his stroller, David and Grace sat by a fountain. The golden light of the setting sun illuminated their faces, creating an almost magical moment. "I never imagined this would happen," Grace said softly. "This life, this peace. I never thought it would be possible." David looked into her eyes, his heart pounding. "Neither did I," he confessed, his voice husky. "I thought all of this would just be a business deal. But now..." Grace waited, her heart racing, anxious for what he was about to say. "Now, I can't imagine my life without you and Liam," he finally said. "I need you both. Not just to win the inheritance, but to truly live." Grace stared at him, surprised by his confession. Silent tears rolled down her cheeks. For the first time in a long time, she felt important to someone. Not because of a transaction, but for who she truly was. David took her hand, gazing into her eyes, and kissed her, an affectionate, passionate kiss filled with love. In that moment, without words, they both understood that the agreement had transformed into something much greater. They had found in each other what they never knew they were looking for, a family. But as in every story, fate had new challenges in store. Peter, suspicious of David's sudden change in behavior, decided to follow him. Discovering the truth, he confronted his brother at their grandfather's mansion. "I know you're lying," Peter said angrily. "That baby isn't yours, and I'm going to tell Grandpa everything." David, left with no choice, hadn't yet had time to present Grace and Liam to his grandfather as part of the plan. He saw everything falling apart. The next day, he confessed everything to his grandfather. But to his surprise, old Henry wasn't shocked. "I already knew, David," his grandfather said with a soft smile. "I knew you'd come up with something, some plan to not lose your part of the inheritance. But what really matters is what you've learned along the way. You've finally understood the true value of life." Grace, standing by David's side, felt her heart warm. What started as a deal had turned into true love. And so, what was meant to be just an arrangement became the greatest achievement of their lives. David didn't just inherit the family empire, he found something much more valuable: the love of Grace and the joy of being Liam's father. The life he had been searching for finally made sense, not because of the money, but because of the people he chose to love. Throughout this journey, David discovered that true wealth isn't found in power or money, but in the human connections we build along the way. What began as a cold, strategic agreement evolved into something far deeper: his love for Grace and the responsibility of being a father to Liam. The great lesson here is that sometimes, the things we seek most come from the places we least expect. Love, companionship, and the value of family are the true treasures in life, and in the end, it's those bonds that truly fulfill us and give us purpose. If you enjoyed this heartwarming story, leave a like and share in the comments what touched you the most. We want to know, what moment surprised you the most? Thanks for making it to the end. I'll see you in the next one.